Okay, I think we can get started. I'd like to welcome you to this public meeting of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board. This is just one meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine renewal lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City, with leases commencing or being renewed on or after October 1, 2018, and on or before September 30th, 2019. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Hillary Botine.
Present.
Rodrigo Camarena.
Present.
Shayla Garcia.
Present.
Leah Goodridge. Cecilia Hosa.
Present.
David Reese.
Present.
Scott Walsh is absent. Kathleen Roberts present. Let the record show that we have a quorum. The preliminary vote for rent-stabilized renewal lease adjustments will be held on April 26th at the Great Hall, Cooper Union, 77th Street in Manhattan, starting at 7 p.m. There are copies of the most current 2018 meeting schedule in your folders, and it can also be found on our website, nyc.gov/RGB. Copies of our schedule are here today. Please note that the public hearings and final voting meeting are finalized and are included on our most recent schedule. Follow-up RGB report memos were produced by staff to address questions that were asked at our previous meetings. These memos were emailed to the members prior to this meeting, and they are in your folder. You will also find in your folder proposed language for the apartment and hotel orders in anticipation for the vote on April 26th. This language was emailed to the board members prior to this meeting. Please note that the annual filing of the Conflicts of Interest Board Financial Disclosure Report filing period has begun. The filing period will end May 4, 2018. Please note a change to this year's filing procedure. The filer's receipts will now be emailed directly to the filer upon submission of his/her annual disclosure report as proof of submission. It is no longer necessary for you to return a signed receipt to the RGB.
Just for the preliminary, the doors will be open at 6.
Okay. So we're ready to proceed with the testimony of apartment owners. Our first presenter is Vito Signorile. Is that right? Signorile, okay, from the Rent Stabilization Association. Do you all want to come up at once? Sure. So Michael Slattery, Chris Athineos, and Joseph Condon as well. Oh, all right.
Get better at numbers.
Okay. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
We can begin? Thank you.
Yes, please.
Good morning, members of the board. My name is Vito Signorile. I am the Director of Communications of the Rent Stabilization Association. I am here on behalf of our 25,000 members who own or manage the majority of the city's approximate 1 million rent-stabilized apartments. We would like to welcome the new board members of the Rent Guidelines Board and express our desire to engage in a productive dialogue with you. We knew that the goal of this current administration, a campaign promise made during 2013, was to prioritize tenant affordability and needs via the RGB, and Mayor Bill de Blasio made it clear that he would appoint like-minded individuals to the board to carry out his agenda. What we did not expect, however, was the degree to which the Rent Guidelines Board would tip the scale to the tenant side and completely abandon the metrics that have guided this board for many years. Over the past 4 years, owners of rent-stabilized properties have experienced an increase in building operating costs in excess of 16%. Over the same period, this board has limited owners to a mere 2.25% increase in one-year guidelines. After 4 years of inadequate rent guidelines that included 2 consecutive rent freezes, we sit before this board asking for a return to a reasonable balance between owner and tenant interests. Some on the board will say that the traditional metrics of the board should be abandoned because they consider only owner costs and not the affordability issues confronting some tenants. To this, we say that the protections afforded to tenants by the rent stabilization law are limitations on the level of permissible rent increase set by this board, not the precise level of rent increase. The Rent Guidelines Board does have an obligation to enact rent guideline increases necessary to preserve the housing stock, and the Rent Guidelines Board is failing in this aspect of its mission. We clearly understand the plight of low-income tenants hard-pressed by the rising tide of housing costs, but this board needs to understand that the housing costs, both homeowner and renter, have been rising across the country. Paying 30% of income can no longer be considered a hardship, but a new norm. Moreover, spending a larger percentage of income on housing is not necessarily a burden, as other consumer costs such as food and having clothing declined. Fortunately, the rising burden of housing affordability seems to have leveled off. The 2017 New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey clearly shows that the affordability has budged over the last 9 years. Even better, incomes are finally rising faster than rents, 10.9% versus 8.1% over the last 3 years. Housing and neighborhood conditions are better than ever. Overcrowding has been reduced, indicating that more households are able to achieve independent living, and over 69,000 housing units have been added to the city over the last 3 years to create the largest housing stock in the city's history, and by all accounts, the economy has more than recovered from the recession of 2008, with more jobs being produced each year and the lowest unemployment levels in recent history. A growing and steady economy, coupled with rising building operating costs and historically low guidelines over a 4-year period, has now put the board in a position where it can and must compensate owners for the inadequate guidelines that were approved by this board. Some members of this board will argue that building owners are not hurting, reflecting in a continued increase in net operating income, which negates the need for adequate rent increases. But if this board's goal is to reach the point where owner profitability does not increase, or even worse, where owners do not generate profits at all, then we are heading down a path where the city's regulated housing stock will mirror the horrors of the city's public housing stock. It is no secret, particularly after this past winter, that the living conditions at NYCHA complexes have produced uninhabitable conditions for its residents. The lack of adequate capital funding is clearly the reason why timely and necessary maintenance cannot be performed. If owners of rent-stabilized housing are continued to be deprived of that adequate funding, we will all have a front-row seat at watching the city's aging housing stock fall into disrepair. The vast majority of the city's rent-stabilized apartments are in aging buildings that are constantly in need of maintenance and improvements in order to provide adequate living conditions for its tenants. Over the last 4 years, many owners of older and smaller buildings have found it increasingly difficult to make up for the loss of rental increases on stabilized apartments that they have relied on over the years. Owners have shifted the burden of rising costs to tenants with preferential rents or market rate rents, but owners cannot rely on vacancy increases and burden shifting indefinitely. We also caution the board about an over-reliance on income and expense data as a basis for guideline decisions. We know that this data is incomplete and that it does not include 1/3 of stabilized units in small buildings, that it does not really measure affordability because it does not include mortgage expenses, that it includes incomes from all sources but does not consider all expenses such as MCI costs. This shifting of the burden as a response to inadequate guidelines has compounded the irrationality of the regulatory system, which seeks to impact affordability without any reference to tenant incomes or ability to pay. RSA has made the point over the years that the housing affordability was not a result of high rents, but a result of low incomes. Over the last 4 years, while the city economy has vastly improved, incomes have increased and unemployment is at an all-time low. If rent affordability continues to be an issue despite these positives, then the issue of affordability is far beyond the mandate of this board. While it may be difficult for this board to ignore affordability issues, the actual mandate of this board is to maintain the economic health of the housing industry by authorizing rent increases necessary to meet ever-increasing operating costs has been fundamentally ignored. The board's current approach is unsustainable. Eventually, the price for this approach will be paid in the slow but inevitable decline of the quality of the regulated housing stock. However, the facts depicted by the 2017 Housing and Vacancy Survey, as well as the current 4.5% increase in operating costs reflected in the price index of operating costs, puts the board in a position to essentially reset and properly compensate owners for their increased costs. We hope that this board will realize that it is not high rents, but low incomes that result in the crushing housing cost burdens. For the lowest income households, continuing to hold rents down will provide no relief whatsoever for these tenants. The rent burdens of low-income tenants can only be eased by rent subsidies or income supplements, which have been proposed on the state level over the last few years, but have been ignored by city officials. This year's price index, along with another predicted increase of 3.4 in next year's building operating costs, is all the justification this board needs to reverse course and provide a realistic rate of rent increase. We are proposing modest increases of 4% for a one-year lease and a 7% for a two-year lease. These proposals not only recoup for recent inadequate guidelines, but also stays well within the RGB's own commensurate rent adjustments. Over the past 4 years, this board has deliberately ignored the commensurate ranges, prioritizing a set agenda rather than consider the facts. Please bear in mind that RSA's proposal is only based on those operating costs actually measured by Rent Guidelines Board methodology, not the many operating costs excluded from that methodology, such as the cost of building facade maintenance, increased elevator inspections, lead paint abatement, and any other government mandates imposed since the price index was last updated 35 years ago. However, in RSA's submission to the board, we will be sure to fully highlight a list of these ignored mandates, including the dozens of mandates most recently imposed on owners over the last 4 years under this progressive and pro-tenant city council. We ask this board to reinstate some rationality into this year's rent guideline deliberations that will best serve the long-term interests of the city's tenants, its rental property owners, and the city's economy by proposing appropriate levels of rent increases in this year's preliminary deliberations. Subsequent to the board's preliminary guideline determination, we will provide the board members with a more detailed exposition of themes briefly outlined above. We remain available and look forward to any questions or requests from the board members throughout the deliberation process. On behalf of our membership, I thank you very much for your time and consideration.
Mr. Slattery?
I'll give you copies of our... Okay, thank you.
We only have written
It's coming.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I got more. Sorry. Thanks. Yep. I start charging after this, you know. We'll give you a credit if you give you a bigger rent increase.
Deal.
Good morning.
Good morning, thank you. I'm Michael Slattery, representing the Real Estate Board of New York. We're a trade association with 17,000 members, and we like to provide our perspective regarding the rent adjustments. New York City's rental apartments are a vital asset for the city. These vital assets require regular and reliable capital investment, which is necessary and often expensive. From experience, we know what can happen to rental apartment buildings that lack the revenue needed to finance essential capital repairs. This lack of capital investment can jeopardize the health and safety of the tenants, whether in publicly or privately owned rental housing. According to the latest Housing and Vacancy Survey, the quality of our rental housing and neighborhoods is good, with the lowest measured maintenance deficiencies ever recorded since conditions were first measured in 1991. Likewise, the 2018 RGB Income and Expense Report indicates a decline in distressed properties. We think there are at least 3 reasons for this, for this positive news. One is deregulation, which provides the economic incentive and the capital investment needed to maintain rental housing. Two, the new housing built under 421A, which established the market rent for the market rate units, which also cross-subsidize the affordable units, and the capital investment and preservation that the city has made over the last 2 decades. I would also add that the increases that were granted, over the last decade or so for the last few years, I think was also a contributing factor to that improvement. The pattern of virtually no rent increases in the last few years is dangerous and risky and counterproductive to preserving the high quality of the city's rental housing inventory, especially those units which are more than 50 years old. Unless we rethink our approach to rent increases, our real property tax system, and the methodology used to guide the actions of this board, our city's aging rent-regulated housing inventory will suffer. As for the real property tax inequities, New York City's real property tax system is inequitable and places an inequitable financial burden on rental apartment buildings. In fiscal year 2017, Class 2 properties, which include rental apartment buildings, accounted for 24% of the market value of the City of New York, but paid 37% of the total tax levy. Since 2007, the property tax levy for Class 2 has increased from $5.2 billion to $9.6 billion, an 84% increase, or an 8.4% annual increase. This increase falls disproportionately, however, on rental properties in this class, largely due to a provision in state law that requires co-ops and condos be valued on comparable rental property. A Firm Center report identified 50 individual co-op apartments and 46 multi-unit buildings whose sale price was greater than the city's market value for the entire cooperative building. One striking example was a Manhattan co-op in a 13-unit building that sold for $50 million, while the entire building was valued at $15 million. Likewise, the New York City's Independent Budget Office concluded that residential rental properties in Class 2 were paying significantly higher effective tax rates, and an effective tax rate is the amount of taxes paid compared to the market value of the property. Multifamily elevated buildings were paying an effective rate of 3.7% for every $100 of value. Walk-up apartments were paying 4.2%, and in comparison, co-ops and condos were paying 68 cents per $100 of value. There are some consequences to this inequitable tax treatment and no rent increases. Lenders who used to underwrite loans used to assume that taxes would be 20% of gross rental income. As taxes on apartment rentals increased, due in part to the steady and sizable increase in real property taxes, the systematic inequities in our real property tax system, the level of taxation increased. Some properties now are being taxed in excess of 30% of their gross income. Lenders have now begun to adjust their underwriting analysis to assume these higher taxes. The result of this change is that the amount of capital a building can borrow declines and the amount of equity needed increases. Since the mid-'90s, many of the new Manhattan rental buildings are 80/20s and rent stabilized as a result of the tax exemption. As the tax benefits expire on these properties and the full impact of the inequitable real property tax burden is felt, we are seeing a number of these buildings being sold by traditional long-term rental building owners, even though in many instances these owners can charge market rents. Often these buildings are sold to converters who are less concerned with higher taxes, since the conversion will make them eligible for the co-op condo abatement, which will lower their tax bill. We are also hearing concerns about the pattern of virtual no rent increases from builders of mixed income housing. More generally, as we've seen the property taxes, this new economic reality will find its way into project underwriting and financing. Community Preservation Corporation, which is an important lender for affordable projects, reports that its lending models assume a 2% annual increase in rents. If these assumptions are frustrated or unreliable, lending institutions will be less likely to finance and lend less. We commend the RGB for the voluminous information they provide and the clarity with which they present the many challenges to the data. However, we question, as we did last year, the reliability of using an adjustment of expenses based on an analysis done by RGB and DOF in 1992. At that time, RPIE filings were only recently required. Since then, there has been much more clarity from DOF about what is a permissible expense, and more recently, the rate of compliance has increased significantly. In short, we think that an 8% reduction is much too high and artificially inflates a building's net operating income. In addition, DOF's recent reductions in submitted operating expenses eliminate real and unavoidable costs incurred in managing many rental properties. These arbitrary reductions only inflate the NOI and the value of the property for real property tax purposes. We also question the decision to include a building as rent stabilized if it contains at least one rent stabilized unit. It would inevitably capture buildings that would include predominantly unregulated rents. This inflates reported income for rent-stabilized buildings. As a result, the report is likely to show a growth in income which does not reflect the reality of buildings which contain predominantly rent-stabilized units. This threshold must be meaningfully increased to ensure reliable income results. Also, relying on a methodology that inflates income and arbitrarily reduces expenses results in an overstatement of a building's net operating income and the economic well-being of older buildings with predominantly rent-stabilized units. In conclusion, capital investment is the lifeblood of rental housing. Rental housing with a steady and reliable stream of capital thrives. Where revenue is lacking or constrained by unrealistic restrictions on rent growth, rental buildings suffer. New York City's tax policy of imposing unsustainable high property taxes on rental apartments and the RGB's questionable methodology and its recent decisions to actively suppress rental income is a recipe for placing our inventory of regulated rental housing in jeopardy. Lastly, the new 421A program embodies two fundamental principles essential for expanding and enhancing our rental housing inventory. It omits market-rate apartments from rent stabilization and mandates the inclusion of affordable housing at higher percentages than previously required. Mandating this cross-subsidization of affordable units with market-rate units without rent restrictions will ensure the steady stream of capital for these projects. However, aggregating these newly built units whose initial rent is at market rate with the older rent-regulated units whose baseline rents may have been established 50 years ago and whose location will virtually prevent it from being deregulated harms these older units. RGB needs to recognize that the older rent-regulated inventory has a greater immediate need for capital investment and would benefit from a significantly higher rent increase. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Athineos?
My name is Christopher Athineos. For those of you who don't know me, welcome to the new members of the board. I'm a small property owner from Brooklyn. I'm also vice president of SPONY, the Small Property Owners of New York. I'm here to remind you today of the huge role small property owners play, especially in the outer boroughs, providing decent, affordable housing to New York renters. Our members typically own one building, the building in which they live. Our owners are hands-on property owners doing much of the work themselves. We're in the customer service business. We're there to keep our customers, our tenants, happy. We want to provide them with a safe, decent place to live. We want to provide the highest customer service, but this poses quite a challenge because it is this board which essentially controls our income, yet our expenses, our actual costs, have no limit. The plumber, the facade contractor, the boiler repairman all charge essentially what they want. When the price of copper or steel goes up, the plumber and the boiler repairman passes that along to us, their customers. If we don't have the money, they don't do the work. Yet property owners must do the repairs or the building falls into disrepair. I'm probably the only person in all of New York City that has sympathy for the property managers at NYCHA. I feel their pain. NYCHA is a perfect example of how disinvesting in housing can rear its ugly head. When year after year they patch rather than replace, react rather than prevent, it ultimately leads to those dreaded days when the heat is off for days and weeks at a time. The press, the mayor, and the tenants all demand that the problem be fixed immediately. Yet no one seems to admit that these problems didn't happen overnight, and they won't be fixed overnight. Anyone that owns even a one-family home or lives in a co-op or a condominium understands that costs are constantly rising. And for homes such as the buildings that our members own, brownstones that can be up to 150 years old, 0%, 1.25% just doesn't cut it. The typical knee-jerk reaction is to consider the tenant income over the owner's expenses. I get that. That's fine until that freezing day in January or February when there's no heat and they realize that the boiler needed to be replaced 15 years ago, or the lead paint should have been encapsulated 5 years ago. There is a cost to keeping increases at zero or close to zero. There's no turning back from disinvesting in housing. NYCHA is the perfect example. Yes, in the short term, the tenants are happy they don't have to pay an increase. The mayor can campaign on having frozen rents, and he stood up to the landlord lobby. But as the saying goes, be careful what you wish for. There is a price to pay for not giving the owners ability to cover our costs. Year after year, the city council, the state and federal governments pass laws and mandates that owners are expected to comply with. Yet when they pass these laws and mandates like lead paint, facade maintenance, fire safety, elevator safety, they're not giving us the resources to cover these costs of these very important maintenance items. The board does the study of the PIOC. This should obviously be, and I'm mentioning this more for the newer members, This should obviously be the floor or the starting point for any owner expense study, since it doesn't nearly take into account what owners spend, or more importantly, need to spend on maintaining a building. Because obviously owners, and particularly small owners, cannot spend what we cannot spend what we don't have. The most striking injustice of the PIOC is that it does not measure the frequency of the needed actual repairs. It just measures the increase in the labor or material. So if my plumber hasn't increased his hourly rate last year, it would seem that our costs have not increased at all for that category. However, we have to call the plumber more frequently to replace, not even repair, aging plumbing in the building. Although the board hangs their hat on rising NOI, this does not take into account our membership, small buildings. It doesn't even take into account owners foregoing necessary maintenance, because even though on paper it may show that our incomes went up, it doesn't mean that the income was enough to actually cover the cost of needed repairs and maintenance on our buildings. In closing, I can tell you that small owners are past the breaking point, not approaching it. Each year, we have members who return our membership invoice with a small note thanking us for our service and our organization, but they have sold their building. They not only sell their building, but they leave New York. If we had the resources, our organization would love to do a study of those members that leave SPONY and sell their buildings, those long-term owners, and what effect it has on the maintenance of their building after the sale. We would love to send a customer survey out to the tenants in those buildings to see what effect a change from long-term ownership had on the maintenance of the building. When our members sell, they're selling to two groups. The first are probably speculators who think they will flip or co-op or condo the building. And the second group are probably well-intentioned people who think they can continue to operate the building and make a go of it. Ultimately, when a new owner buys a building, the first expense they'll have to pay is their mortgage bill. After that, it'll be the real estate taxes and then the heat and hot water. And after that, if there's anything left over, it will be for maintenance. Our long-term owners typically either have no mortgage or very little or very low mortgage. So long-term ownership benefits the tenants and the housing stock. Forcing long-term owners to sell and putting us out of business is bad for tenants, it's bad for the city, and bad for the housing stock. I hope this board takes a long-term look at the housing stock and takes our suggestions and comments into account and vote for a reasonable rent increase that will improve the quality of housing for our tenants. Thank you.
Yes, good morning. Welcome to the new members. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Joseph Condon. I'm here representing the Community Housing Improvement Program, also known as CHIP. Thank you for this opportunity to testify. For those of you who don't know, CHIP has been a preeminent housing advocate since 1966. We have about 4,000 members who are either owners or managers of multifamily property. All told, we believe they, in the aggregate, have about 450 to 500,000 units of rental housing throughout New York City. I'd also like to point out that the large majority of buildings owned and operated by CHIP members are predominantly subject to rent stabilization because of their construction date. In other words, they're not receiving tax benefits in exchange for providing this below market housing. However, these property owners do have to account for all the operating costs of an unregulated building despite not being able to charge market rents. And given the low rate of turnover in most non-tax exempt rent stabilized buildings, which is roughly 10% according to a recent IBO study. So because of the low rate of turnover, renewal lease increases from this board are the primary way a rent stabilized apartment's rent can be increased in accordance with increases in operating costs. Which brings me to my first point. We do have a concern that what appears to be a perennial event, this board adopts rent increases that are lower than necessary to cover otherwise objectively determined cost increases for these apartments. In the package you have, I included a chart that tracks the PIOC since 1966, I believe, and then also tracks the one-year increases. And you can see the significant disparity as the years have gone on. Just some numbers over that time. The PIOC has accounted for a compounded 180% increase in operational costs. Meanwhile, the one-year lease increases over that time have accounted for a compounded 81% increase in rent. If we only look at the last 4 RGB orders from 2014 to 2017, the PIOC increased by a compounded roughly 11.5%, while the legal regulated rent increase for one-year leases over that time was only 2.26%, which is less than a fifth of what the PIOC was over that time. And this is even more concerning given what you heard from the other presenters, that the PIOC most likely is an underestimation of costs that building owners have. The concern is that this board, rather than using this objectively determined cost increase data as a guide for adopting rent increases, instead the focus is on NOI and rent burden. Now, those are factors, but we believe that they are not relied on, or they are improperly relied on in this instance. First, because NOI is skewed in several ways, which I'll explain in a second. And second, tenant affordability should not be the driving factor here. Using the subjective factor of how much low-income tenants can afford to pay is not really within the purview of this board, as we believe. But first, let's talk about NOI. So NOI is not really an accurate reflection of building finances because it does exclude significant expenses from its calculations. It excludes capital expenditures as well as reserves. It excludes debt service. Since debt service is arbitrarily excluded from the calculation of expenses, building finances appear much more robust than they are in reality. And not only is the exclusion of capital reserves, not only does it reduce what NOI looks like, but it also skews it because on the other side, when looking at building income, increases from capital expenditures are included. So money that an owner spends to perform capital improvements does not count, but any increases in rent that are achieved through that capital improvement do count. It's sort of like calculating return on investment without accounting for the initial investment. We believe the RGB should either include both capital revenue and capital expenses in the calculation of NOI, or exclude both of them. Counting one but not the other significantly overinflates building income and underestimates the building expenses. Another point about NOI, if looking at the chart on page 10 of the income and expense report, each line on the graph has a general trend upward, but each trend line has a different trajectory, with the upward trend in rent and income outpacing the upward trend in NOI. The lag is even more significant since 2010, and we would ask this board to consider why the NOI has the flattest upward trend while incomes and rents collected show a more drastic upward trajectory. We believe that one takeaway from this is that it proves that the RGB underestimates operational costs. Otherwise, NOI would be increasing at a much higher trajectory in line with rent and income. So it seems apparent that there are operational costs not being properly accounted for. Also, we just want to mention the 64% increase noted in that chart is somewhat misleading. I do realize that's when RGB started tracking this type of information, but using that as the starting point is somewhat misleading because it shows a 64% increase over that time period. But if you look at NOI from the year 2000, you would have a much different picture. if you just look at NOI over that point, there would be an increase of somewhere in between 15 and 20%. So the use of I understand why the RGB includes that all the way back to the 1990, but giving that impression of significant NOI increase over that time is misleading. As far as the rent burden and tenant affordability goes, as justification for adopting guidelines lower than necessary to account for objectively determined cost increases, we believe the sentiment is a noble one, but it is we also believe it is misplaced in this board's deliberations. The commensurate adjustments calculated by the RGB already perform the function of determining what necessary rent increases are. So in other words, those rates already perform the function of getting rid of potential excessive rent increases or potential profiteering by owners. To further discount those rates, even though they've already sort of been objectively determined based on cost increases, there's no concern over profiteering or the excess of the rent increase, but to further discount them on tenant affordability, really transform rent stabilization into an off-budget housing subsidy program. And one of the policy implications of this is that it does put upward pressure on fair market rents in deregulated units. So by attempting to hold NOI constant or even reduce it, this board is essentially conducting a wealth transfer or seizing revenue from these unregulated fair market units and forcing owners to use that to subsidize the operational costs of rent stabilized units. And if the market is already at its limit for those market tenants, then the building owner is essentially forced to take it as a loss, so to speak. I'd also like to make another point on the rent burden. We did see this year that the RGB has gone back and attempted to calculate the impact of Section 8 vouchers on the rent burden numbers, and we appreciate that. But there are also numerous other programs, city programs such as SCREE, DRE, LINK, other subsidy programs, and we'd like to see if the board can get at those numbers too, because we also think that accounting for those will reduce the rent burden that's reported as well. And finally, we'd just like to point out that the MBR factor, which is for rent-controlled units, for the time frame of 2016 and 2017, the DHCR adopted a 9.6 increase over that time period. And for 2018 to 2019, the DHCR adopted a 7.4% increase for those units. And according to the DHCR, these increases represent the actual income required, the actual increase in income required to operate a housing unit while maintaining everything else. So we just want to point that out, because certainly over those time frames, the RGB has not even come close to those numbers. We do think that the long-term interests of tenants and the housing stock overall are better served through moderate increases that cover increases to operating costs, so that quality housing can be provided. This policy has been implemented over the last three decades of this board's, save the last few years, over the last 3 decades of this board's existence. And as you heard from the other presenters, it has proven positive. Housing quality has improved. The stock is in its best condition since the housing vacancy survey began. So we do believe that we need to get back to that type of that policy, the policy of moderate increases. I do appreciate your time, and we're here for any questions. Oh, and we do echo the call for 4% and 7% as a 1 and 2 year lease increase.
Thank you. Any questions for our speakers? David?
Sure.
Thank you for your testimony. So I feel like I heard 3 types of comments. Some arguments that the board is acting inconsistent with the law, a sense that the board is using either bad models or bad data to generate its reports, and then also that we have some bad policies that are bad for New York City in the long term. So I'm going to make a series of general requests, but then I wanted to address some of them in particular. So in terms of where you're saying we're inconsistent with law, that is not my understanding. And so to the extent that that is your position, I'd like to have specifics as to where we're inconsistent with law. In terms of the bad models and the bad data, I think last year the board tried to incorporate critiques of the models and data that it used and to generate refined reports. So I'd ask that you provide detailed alternatives with pros and cons of your proposed changes to see, the goal is to get the best model to describe what's happening in the housing market. And so if we can make refinements, we would love that. But the more concrete your suggestions are, the easier it is to kind of work it through with the staff and try to incorporate that into our models. And then obviously, there's disagreements about policies, but certainly the positions you propose should be taken into consideration. I just wanted to talk about some of the specifics that you had raised. So, Mr. Signorile,
It's like a Russian doll question.
you can. Those are just the general categories. If you want to respond to that, or I can give you some specifics.
If you'd like answers for the first questions at this time, then if I'd like to answer those first. With regard to critiques of the current calculations, we don't disagree with anything that's used in the current calculations in the board's reports. We just believe they're extremely outdated in terms of there are dozens and dozens of mandates that have been imposed on owners over the years where these take into account the expenses that they have annually, and that's not calculated by the board's reports, and these are very expensive mandates.
So I guess I have 2 questions in that regard. One would be, if you're saying that model of expenses is outdated, how can we make it better concretely? And then is there any evidence that those expenses that are not taken into account have risen at a rate that is higher than those that are taken into account?
Well, we've made this suggestion annually, and we're going to outline this in the submission that we provide to the board in terms of the mandates that are consistent every year for owners. But in terms of facade maintenance, lead inspections, and additional mandates that have been imposed over the years, conversions such as that, these are consistent annual expenses that owners have, and that also includes work to buildings that cannot be used as an MCI increase, and we're gonna highlight that in our submission.
And you're going to highlight it both in terms of how much absolute expense those new mandates have added, as well as what the annual increase in those expenses are?
For the mandates, for the expenses that do increase annually, yes, we will include that. But for those that have been consistent, we'll highlight that also.
I just want to add to that point. Certainly specifics can be provided, but if you just look at the legislative activity of the Housing and Buildings Committee of the New York City Council, you will see that last year they passed, somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 bills. They passed 70 bills. And that's, I think, double from what they passed the year before. So I think we can provide a list of, what mandates were included in those bills. But just looking at that alone, it should give you some idea that the requirements on these owners, the compliance obligations, have become significantly more complex and and more just not only more complex, but they're just more in general, and that adds to the cost of operating this type of housing.
That's certainly helpful to see, but it would be more helpful if it can be quantified some way so we can take it into account in terms of modeling the costs.
Well, you know, CHIP is a small office. We have about only four or five employees. Unfortunately, we can give suggestions, but to do, this board has the staff to do the research, so we can give suggestions, but to sort of put the obligation on us to do the research and present it to you is somewhat, I think, unfair.
I would, 2 points. One, using 1992 efforts certainly needs to be updated. Finance has gotten much better at both collecting RPI information and analyzing that information. So I would think that a more contemporary number for what you think is an appropriate reduction, which I think is probably much lower than 8%. And two, we need to recognize, looking back at some of the income and expense studies that were done that go back to the early 80s and even before, that was a time when there was no vacancy decontrol, units couldn't get out of rent stabilization, and maybe it was appropriate at that point to use, if it had one rent stabilized unit, you used it. Now that more and more units are coming out of rent stabilization, as well as more units being built where they start at a market rent that's significantly higher than what I would call the legacy rent stabilized properties. I think using that income information really inflates the income that these properties are getting, and I think that's needs to be corrected. One, certainly you could say you should be only using information from buildings that are less than half or more than half rent stabilized, as opposed to just one unit being stabilized.
So on those 2 points, it would be great to have kind of concrete proposals that we could take and discuss with the staff, both in terms of what's the right start date for looking at the data, and then does the data exist to split up an analysis in more than half, less than half rent stabilized?
Well, that's what you got the staff for, I assume. You asked for concrete suggestions. One, I would say go to the DOF and find out what the current conditions are in terms of what they believe should be the appropriate reduction. And two, I would start with at least half the building has to be rent stabilized in order to use the income from those properties.
Thank you. I'll defer to the others.
Just one more. But as far as data that you do have some data from DHCR on capital expenses. I mean, you see how much in MCIs they approve every year. So, but that is not incorporated whatsoever into an NOI number that also looks at debt service and capital expenditures.
Other questions for our presenters?
But I just have a comment, just for clarity for other board members, just to think about. From the CHIP testimony, I think it is helpful because we do follow policy on this board, just to make sure that people understand. When the 421A buildings were introduced in the 80s, the cross-subsidy concept was introduced because there was a tax abatement. And what we're talking about, and I don't know if we'd always use the term legacy properties, but the pre-77 properties have no ability to maintain themselves in a really highly raising tax environment. So 1977 was the cutoff, correct? I'm asking Andrew. 1977 is when we cut off the buildings.
74.
74. Okay, so 74 is when we cut off the building. Approximately 6 years later, people realized that this system didn't work, and the policy for building housing from the 80s on acknowledged that there was a need for cross-subsidy as the only way to build affordable housing and new construction with union labor, but at the same time had a mechanism that had a tax abatement. So I am very sensitive to Chris's comments that small owners who we don't consider their data at all because they're less than 10 units, and even larger owners who are over 11 units, taxes just go up 9 to 12% a year, and there's no mechanism to deal with this. So that's my...
Thank you. Any other questions for our presenters?
I have a question, just a narrow question specifically for Mr. Athineos. I, like you, am interested in this idea of long-term owners leaving the city, but I just wanted to know specifically, how many do you hear from every year? Do you guys have any sense of how the scale of this issue?
Well, I mean, we have about 1,000 members, and I wish I could, I mean, we were just starting to now see, 20, 30 members leaving every year. And, before, families, kids would take over from their parents, and we just had a meeting the other day, and we get about 50 to 75 members at a membership meeting, even though we have 1,000 members. It's more like a therapy session. People just come and vent. But, and we see a lot of old timers, and sometimes you see people that are children, but even now the children don't even want to take over the buildings. They just don't have the energy for it. And I think it's becoming so complicated that, like Joe said, that the mandates are so complicated and complex that they don't even have the experience or the knowledge to take care of this. So they selling out, I guess the people are buying them, co-opting these small 8-unit buildings and brownstones. If they're bigger buildings, they could sell them to a bigger, more experienced manager because they can't afford to hire property managers. But only now are we starting to see how we can measure this because, we're just losing our members. I wish I had more concrete numbers to give you, but maybe in the next year, we're a volunteer organization. We just charge $60 a year for our membership since 1984, the same price, just to cover our meeting costs and little administrative costs. But we're going to try to work on it. I would like to come to this board and I think we have more in common with the tenants than you would think. Because we know what it's like when you talk about, I listened to you over the years, Shayla, about tenant affordability and income affordability, and we know what it's like not to have enough income to cover your expenses, whether it's the housing expenses or whether it's putting clothes on your children's back, on food on their tables. So we get it, but we're just trying to balance, but we have but our responsibility is to maintain good housing. And I have to tell you, our members are not the type of members that you read about in the Post or the news, the guys that are in jail because they're not maintaining their building. For our members, either they want to maintain it and follow the law the way we're supposed to, or we're going to sell it and get out because there's no in between. And it's very frustrating. We feel like we're backed into a corner where, we can't do the right thing even though our intentions are good.
Any other questions or comments for response by the presenters?
I guess I just have one other. In the testimony, there was some reference to what sounded like anecdotal information, but if that anecdotal information could be somehow put down to paper in some way that is verifiable, that would be helpful. So, in the RSA testimony, you say that many owners of older and smaller buildings have found it increasingly difficult to make up for the loss of rental increases on stabilized apartments. It would be great to have some evidence, evidence other than just that general statement. There was another statement along the lines. REBNY's testimony said that there's evidence of concerns of owners of mixed income housing projects relating to the low rent increases. That is an issue that has been kind of stated broadly last year by others who have provided testimony. It would be great to have some kind of concrete evidence of that. Because that certainly would be relevant to our decision making.
Absolutely. And, one thing that we urge as an organization is for our members to come out and testify at the public hearings. And, we commend the board for continuing the outer borough hearings. It's certainly convenient for our members who, and the one thing to keep in mind about our members are a lot of them are small building owners where running their building is not their only job. So some of them work at night, and a lot of them can't make these public hearings, but it's certainly convenient for them. If there's a property owner in Brooklyn to come to the Brooklyn hearing, it's very helpful for them. And, we're going to urge them to come out. We know based off of our monthly membership meetings that these low guidelines, they have put them in a position, as we stated in our testimony, to consider other routes to increase the income in their buildings. And we will have them come out and testify before the board to give direct examples of that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
More for Andrew. What information can we get on rent subsidies? I know it's a missing piece from the tenant income piece. We kind of try to work our way around it. Can we get, what rent subsidy information can we get over time? To see how those numbers are increasing or decreasing?
Well, I mean, SCREE and DRE is something that we can track, and Section 8 is something we can track over time. Section 8, we've discussed about using the HVS and eliminating that from those about 80,000 tenants who get Section 8. So we give a, renting income ratio for those folks. And then if we eliminate the Section 8 people who in the HVS have, they're recorded, or most of them at 100% of their income, just how they report, it lowers it a bit.
Right.
But we haven't had that data this year, but we can go back to 2014. So we sort of account for Section 8. But SCREE and DRE are programs that, eliminating those figures from the rent-to-income ratio is not simply that if you're a SCREE tenant and you're paying more than a third of your income in rent, you qualify, but that SCREE tenant can still be paying 50% of their increase in rent.
Right.
So it's a little different to take those kind of numbers out, but HVS does have that data where you can remove those particular groups once we get the whole file, which we don't have yet. But and I'm not sure if that's those kind of things that we can track.
But the SCREE and DRE tenant are not getting increases whether this board gives an increase or not. I guess if the board gave a decrease, I guess they wouldn't get that either. It's not really contemplated. But what about one-shot deals and kind of all of the other various city programs that are expended each year?
I just want to make a quick note that for the first point is that for some of these programs, you can't double dip. So, for example, if you have, you can't freeze your rent and then at the same time have like another subsidy like Section 8. So that's the first point. And the other is that for a lot of these other subsidies that are being mentioned, FEPS or LINK, it actually requires the rent to be lower. So for example, if you have a household of, I believe, 2 people, at one point, the FEPS levels, in order to even get some of these programs, it requires your rent to be, I believe for 2 people right now, it might be $1,200. So, that's something else to think about. Even to qualify for these programs, the rent needs to be lower, and then all of the subsidies, you can't have multiple subsidies at once. So,
but
and the taxes,
1,200 is
the
very
SPONY
close
and
to
DRE,
our
there are abatements
to our mean and average, right?
Right, but you can say the same thing about Section 8 and SCREE and DRE, because landlords are still seeing the increases that whatever increases landlords get, they're still seeing that increase in rent. The tenant is not paying for it, but they're still somehow getting that money. And so I think that does capture like what landlords are getting in a year, or what they're seeing as potential income or profits, because they're getting that money. Regardless of who's paying, it's still money that's coming in.
Right. So the income is right, but with the on the rent burden, that's where the issue is. Not
Right,
so.
but I think that if we tallied up who sits on this board right now and said if we would like to be paying 30% of our income or 50% of our income or 80% of our income, as many tenants do in the city, I think we would all say that that's not like where we want to be living as a city, as a country, where people can't actually feed their families, clothe their families. And to your point earlier, that isn't what we want to be creating. And so I think that is stuff to be taken into consideration, and the Supreme Court actually upheld the decision of rent freezes for 2 years years as a result of the fact that we should be looking at income and affordability for tenants in making our determination. So I think that we have to look at everything and sort of figure out like what are the things that we want to be upholding and looking at the data and making decisions on that basis.
Well, I mean, you're right. You look at it, or whether it's this board or whether it's the city and the state and the federal government, just like with NYCHA. I mean, I'm sure the mayor doesn't want the NYCHA tenants to live in this kind of deplorable condition, but no one's coming up, with the money to pay for these improvements on these buildings. So we just have to realize, and I'm not saying this board or the city and the state government, we all have to realize that there's a price to pay for whether we keep the rents low to balance the needs of the tenant affordability issue, but there is a price to pay, in terms of maintaining the buildings.
There is another metric in the HVS which we can report on eventually. It's out-of-pocket rent. So that's what the tenant is actually paying. So, but it's not something that we can calculate
So we
yet.
could take that and
Which we always
recalculate.
report that when we can. There is an out-of-pocket rent.
Andrew, do we adjust the affordability based on on Section 8, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we don't adjust average rent based on Section 8. So when we are looking at the average rents received by a landlord, are we, like Shayla says, are we including the Section 8 subsidy in the calculation of the average rent? So in other words, are we excluding it for affordability? Effectively, exactly what Shayla said. Are we excluding for affordability, but including for rent received?
Well, rent received is what, if they're paying a contract rent or a gross rent, that's what the owner is receiving. So you would continue to receive that. The owner is getting that in one
So our
respect
data,
or another, right?
Our data, I'm kind of asking this, but our data is accurately reflecting it in affordability and accurately reflecting it in rents received.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Which
because
I'm
they're
not sure
still,
if we're
the
all on
owner is
same
still
page.
getting that, unless the tenant's just not reporting their rent or paying their rent, but that's reflected certainly in the I&E because that's rent collected. It's
Okay.
not, right, so.
Other questions or comments? I think we've concluded this part of our dialogue. Thank you very much for your presentations.
Thank you very much.
We take a few minutes.